Elena Cho watched the board meeting through a live stream link nobody had bothered to formally revoke. 3 full years after anyone in that room had last spoken her name out loud. An old administrative password that had simply never been deactivated after her departure. James Averill sat quietly at the head of the table, the same seat he'd sat in the day he pushed her out, listening to a 28-year-old engineer named Priya Nataraj calmly explain, point by point, exactly why the board should remove him as CEO. Her voice steady in a way Elena remembered wanting her own voice to be 4 years earlier in that same room. Elena had never told Priya to do this. She had never told Priya anything at all about James. Not really. Not his name attached to any specific accusation. Not the story of her own exit. Nothing that could be traced back to a deliberate plan. What she'd done 3 years earlier was much quieter than that, and much harder to trace back to a single decision, a single conversation, or a single act of revenge anyone could point to and call unfair. Elena and James met in a graduate engineering program and founded Lockstep together 4 years later. A fintech startup built around a fraud detection algorithm Elena had designed almost entirely on her own during 2 years of unpaid nights and weekends before the company even had a name, working out the core statistical model on a whiteboard in her apartment long before either of them had quit their day jobs. James handled the parts Elena had no interest in: investor meetings, hiring, the public-facing version of the company that showed up in press coverage and pitch decks, a division of labor that felt, at the time, like a genuinely fair split of very different but equally necessary work. For 3 years, that division of labor worked well enough that Elena genuinely believed James understood exactly how much of Lockstep's actual value lived inside the algorithm she'd built, and how little of it lived in anything he personally contributed to the underlying technology. She trusted him enough to let her own equity vesting schedule, her legal protections, and the technical documentation of who had actually invented what sit largely unexamined for years. The kind of trust that only makes sense in retrospect once you understand exactly how expensive it turned out to be. James was, by every account she could have given a friend at the time, generous with praise in private, quick to tell her the company was nothing without her, in exactly the kind of conversations that never happened in front of investors or board members. A pattern that felt, at the time, like modesty on his part, rather than a deliberate separation of 2 different audiences. 2 entirely different versions of the same story being carefully maintained side by side. That trust is exactly why what happened next worked as well as it did. If this is the kind of story you come here for, betrayal that gets answered the hard, real way, hit subscribe now, because this channel exists for exactly this. Not fantasy revenge, but what real, patient consequences actually look like when someone is willing to wait years for them. Let's go back to where it started to unravel. As Lockstep approached its Series B funding round, James began quietly renegotiating the internal story of how the company had been built, in conversations Elena wasn't present for. Investors started referring to the fraud detection algorithm as James's technology in meetings, a phrase that first appeared in a term sheet draft Elena only saw by accident, forwarded to her by a junior associate who assumed she'd already reviewed it, and who had no idea the phrasing would mean anything unusual to her at all. Elena had helped negotiate that very term sheet clause herself, years earlier, treating it as a minor administrative formality neither of them ever expected to actually matter down the road. The kind of boilerplate language every young company includes, and every young founder skims past without reading closely, trusting that goodwill would always outlast the fine print. When Elena raised the issue directly with James, he told her the investors needed a clean story, and that internal credit would be sorted out properly later, once the round closed. A promise that in practice meant nothing at all, and that she had no way of enforcing beyond taking his word for it one more time, the way she had for 3 years running. Buried in her original founding agreement, in language she'd signed 4 years earlier without a lawyer of her own reviewing it, since James had suggested using the same startup lawyer for both of them to save money in the company's early, cash-strapped days, was a cliff clause tied to a board vote on founder role restructuring. A clause James had never mentioned again until the week the board, stacked increasingly with his own hires and allies, voted to restructure Elena's role into an advisory position with a fraction of her original equity. The board meeting where the restructuring passed took less than 20 minutes, according to the minutes Elena later obtained. She wasn't present for it. James had scheduled it during a week she was traveling to visit her mother, a scheduling detail she only recognized as deliberate months later, once the pattern of everything else that had happened became impossible to read any other way. Elena didn't leave quietly by choice. She fought the board vote as hard as her limited legal standing allowed, hiring a lawyer only after the restructuring had already been approved, when her leverage was already gone, spending money she didn't have on legal advice that arrived, by her lawyer's own honest assessment, roughly 2 years too late to change the outcome. James, in the weeks that followed, began a second, less visible campaign. Quiet conversations with mutual contacts in the fintech investor community, describing Elena, without ever quite saying it outright, as talented but difficult to work with, someone who'd struggled with the pressure of scaling a company. James never once, as far as Elena could ever determine, said anything about her that could be quoted directly and called false. That precision was, in its own way, the most unsettling part of the entire campaign. It meant he understood exactly what he was doing, calibrating each comment carefully enough to survive scrutiny while still landing with real, lasting effect. None of it was a direct lie anyone could point to and formally dispute. It was calibrated exactly precisely enough to make investors quietly hesitant about backing anything Elena tried to build next, without ever giving her a specific accusation to respond to or correct. The kind of vague, deniable damage that never shows up in any single conversation, but accumulates steadily across dozens of them. Within 8 months, 2 separate opportunities Elena had been seriously pursuing, one a role at another fintech company, one her own attempt at raising a small seed round for a new idea, both quietly stalled out, for reasons nobody would state plainly to her face, leaving her with nothing concrete to push back against, only a pattern she could sense but never quite prove. The strangest part, Elena later said, wasn't losing the equity or even the reputation damage. It was watching people she'd considered genuine friends inside the fintech world gradually stop returning her messages with the same warmth, never with any explanation, simply a slow cooling she could feel happening in real time without ever being able to point to the exact moment it started or the exact conversation that had caused it. Elena spent the better part of a year working contract engineering jobs well below her actual skill level, watching from a careful distance as Lockstep closed its Series B at a valuation that made James, on paper, worth more money than she'd ever see from her diluted, restructured stake. Industry newsletters ran profiles of James as a rising fintech founder, crediting him, in increasingly confident language, with building the industry's most sophisticated fraud detection system, a description that, each time she read it, described her own unpublished code almost line for line, phrases that occasionally sounded close enough to her own private design notes that she wondered whether he'd once glanced over her shoulder more carefully than she'd realized. She kept a private, dated archive of her own early design documents, code commits, and whiteboard photographs from the company's first 2 years, evidence that could, in theory, support a legal claim to the algorithm's true authorship, stored carefully across 2 separate backups after a friend, only half joking, suggested she should treat it like something worth protecting. She never filed anything. The math of it was simple and unforgiving. Fighting James in court would cost more money than she had, take years she didn't want to spend reliving the worst period of her professional life, and offer no guarantee of an outcome that would actually restore what she'd lost, only the exhausting chance of proving, publicly and expensively, something she already knew privately to be true. She thought, more than once during that year, about what it would feel like to simply disappear from the industry entirely, to take the contract, work steadily and quietly, and stop caring what James's company did or said about her, to build some completely different, quieter life far away from anything resembling a fintech startup. She never fully managed it. There was always another article, another mention at a conference she happened to overhear, another small reminder that the story of Lockstep continued to be told without her in it, no matter how deliberately she tried to look away. For a while, Elena considered the same kind of institutional route this channel has covered before. Filing a formal complaint, going to a journalist covering the fintech industry, building the same kind of documented, procedural case that has worked in other stories on this channel. She researched it seriously enough to draft an outline of what such a complaint would need to include, spending an entire weekend mapping out timelines and gathering exhibit numbers for evidence she already knew she had. She ultimately decided against it, for reasons specific to her own situation, rather than any general judgment about that approach. The non-disparagement and confidentiality clauses buried in her exit agreement, the same document containing the cliff clause that had cost her the equity, made any public statement legally risky in ways a formal institutional complaint wouldn't necessarily protect her from without years of additional litigation just to establish standing. A drawn-out legal fight, even a winnable one, would also keep her financially and emotionally tied to James and Lockstep for years longer than she could tolerate, reliving the same betrayal in deposition after deposition long after she wanted to be building something new instead. What she wanted instead wasn't a ruling in her favor from an outside authority. It was distance from James entirely, and some quiet confidence that his story wouldn't simply end in triumph while hers ended in this. There was also, if she was honest with herself, a simpler reason underneath the practical ones. She genuinely didn't know, after everything, whether winning a legal case against James would actually make her feel any different, or whether it would simply extend the worst chapter of her career by another few painful years with a slightly better ending attached. The money mattered, but the money wasn't really the wound. The wound was watching someone she'd trusted completely rewrite the story of what they'd built together, calmly and successfully, in real time, in front of everyone, while she had no real way to stop the rewriting from sticking. 14 months after leaving Lockstep, Elena attended a small regional engineering conference, mostly to reconnect with a professional community she'd been quietly avoiding since her departure, more out of habit and low motivation than any dramatic decision to isolate herself. There, she met Priya Nataraj, a sharp, early-career engineer who'd recently joined Lockstep's fraud detection team, full of the same kind of unguarded technical enthusiasm Elena remembered having herself, years earlier, before any of this happened, asking the kind of eager, slightly naive questions Elena recognized instantly from her own first year in the field. Elena never told Priya she'd co-founded Lockstep. She let the conversation stay where Priya had started it. Technical questions about fraud detection architecture that Elena, as it happened, understood better than almost anyone else Priya had ever spoken with. Answers that came easily and specifically enough that Priya assumed, reasonably, she was simply talking to a very experienced engineer from a different company entirely. Over the following months, an informal mentorship developed, coffee conversations and occasional calls, entirely focused on Priya's own technical growth and career development, with Elena's history at Lockstep staying carefully, deliberately unmentioned. A small, private omission that never felt to Elena like a lie so much as a boundary she had every right to keep. Elena told herself, in those early months of the mentorship, that she simply enjoyed talking shop with someone who reminded her of an earlier, less guarded version of herself. Someone who hadn't yet learned to be careful in the specific ways Elena had been forced to learn. That was true as far as it went. It was also, she'd admit much later, not the entire truth of why she kept showing up to those coffee conversations so consistently, month after month, even during stretches when her own contract work left her exhausted and short on free time. What Elena offered Priya, consistently, over that first year, wasn't information about James or Lockstep's internal politics. It was the specific set of habits Elena wished, painfully, that she'd built for herself years earlier. Document everything, date every design decision, keep your own independent record of what you build and when you build it, never let verbal promises about credit later substitute for anything in writing, and read every legal document you sign as though you already expect to need it as evidence someday, no matter how much you trust the person asking you to sign it. There was one piece of advice Elena repeated more than any other, phrased carefully enough that it never sounded like it was aimed at anyone specific, never once naming James or Lockstep even indirectly. The people who trust you the most are exactly the people you have the least practical protection against, precisely because trust is what makes you stop checking. She meant it, when she said it, as a general truth about professional life. Priya, hearing it for the first time, took it as exactly that, a piece of hard-won wisdom from someone who clearly knew what she was talking about, without any particular story attached. Priya, ambitious and quick, absorbed these habits completely, treating them as good general engineering practice rather than as any kind of specific warning about anyone in particular. She began keeping meticulous records of her own growing contributions to Lockstep's fraud detection system, a habit that had nothing to do with suspicion of James, specifically, and everything to do with the professional discipline Elena had modeled for her, month after month, without ever explaining exactly where she'd learned to value it so highly. By her second year at Lockstep, Priya's personal documentation habits had become something of a running joke among her closer colleagues, who teased her, affectionately, for treating every minor design decision like evidence in a future trial she had no reason yet to expect. 2 years into Priya's time at Lockstep, as the company approached a Series C round, James began the same quiet pattern Elena remembered intimately. Describing key technical advances, ones Priya had personally designed and built, as products of his own strategic vision in investor conversations, and floating, in board discussions Priya wasn't yet senior enough to attend. A role restructuring that would formalize her position as subordinate to a new external hire James was courting. A hire James described to the board as necessary senior leadership the fraud detection team currently lacked. Priya, unlike Elena 4 years earlier, had a complete, dated, independently verifiable, meticulously organized record of exactly what she'd built. And when, going back to her very first week at the company, alongside a working understanding of exactly how easily verbal promises about future credit could evaporate once a funding round closed, an understanding she'd absorbed so thoroughly, she barely remembered it had come from anywhere in particular, rather than simply being common sense. When she noticed the pattern forming, the vague investor language, the sudden interest in an external senior hire, the timing tied suspiciously closely to the upcoming round, she didn't confront James directly the way Elena once had. She quietly began reaching out to board members she'd built genuine, independent relationships with over 2 years, the same kind of relationship building Elena had modeled without ever labeling it as a defensive strategy at all. Priya later admitted to a close colleague that the moment she truly understood something was wrong wasn't any single conversation with James. It was noticing, almost by accident, that the external hire he wanted to bring in was being given access to technical documentation before anyone had formally discussed her own reporting structure changing at all. A small procedural detail that would have meant nothing to someone without Elena's habit of noticing exactly which documents got shared, and when, and to whom. The board meeting Elena watched through an old, never-revoked live stream link wasn't a coup Priya had planned for months in advance. It was, by her own later account to colleagues, a decision she made only after realizing James intended to formalize the same restructuring pattern that had, coincidentally, already happened once before at this exact company. A story Priya had never actually heard, because Elena had never told her, and because most of the people currently on Lockstep's board hadn't been there 4 years earlier to remember it either. Priya presented her documented contributions plainly, without accusation, framing the conversation entirely around what was best for the company's technical leadership going into a critical funding round, not around any personal grievance against James, a framing that made it considerably harder for the board to dismiss her as simply upset about a demotion. The board, several of whom had genuinely admired Priya's work for 2 years and had no particular loyalty to James beyond his founder title, and who had, in James's own external hire, an easy alternative explanation that didn't require publicly admitting fault, voted to restructure his role instead of hers. James Averill left lockstep within the month, in a departure the company's press release described, almost word for word, using the same careful, nonspecific language he had once used to describe Elena's own exit, language about pursuing new opportunities, and an amicable transition that fooled almost nobody who had watched either departure closely. James, according to two people present in the room that day, seemed genuinely stunned by the vote, less by the fact that a challenge had come at all than by how calmly, quietly, and thoroughly it had been prepared, as though he'd expected, if this moment ever came, to see it coming from much further away. Elena never spoke to Priya about what happened, then or afterward, not even years later when the two of them, by coincidence, ended up on a conference panel together. She never took credit for it, because there was no specific action to take credit for. No plan, no instruction, no request that anyone do anything to James on her behalf. Nothing a lawyer could describe as intentional interference, even if James had somehow suspected her involvement and gone looking for it. What she had actually done, years earlier, was simpler and slower than any single act of revenge could have been. She had taught one person, patiently and without any stated agenda, the exact set of habits that made it much harder for James Averill to do to someone else what he had once done to her. Elena closed the live stream link before the vote count was even fully announced, already fairly certain, from the tone in the room alone, how it would go. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly, watching it happen. What she felt, closer to it, was something quieter and harder to name out loud. The specific relief of watching a debt finally settle itself, years after she'd stopped actively expecting repayment of any kind at all. That's the particular shape silent revenge takes when it actually works. Not a single dramatic confrontation, but a seed planted early enough and carefully enough that the person who planted it barely needs to be present when it finally grows into something the target never sees coming and can never quite trace back to a single cause. Elena didn't destroy James. She simply made sure that the specific advantage he'd relied on with her, an unprepared, overly trusting founder with no independent paper trail, wouldn't be available to him the next time he reached for it. And then she waited, without any guarantee it would ever matter, for long enough that she'd nearly forgotten to expect anything from it at all. If you've ever passed on something hard-won, a habit, a piece of advice, a boundary you learned the expensive way, without knowing exactly where it would end up landing, tell us about it in the comments. And if stories like Elena's are the reason you're here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next time we're closing out this cycle with the block that started it all over again. The lie that held an entire life together, and what happens the moment it finally stops holding.